First, I want to welcome you. My name is David Elwood. I am the Dean at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm also fortunate to be a member of the board of Abt Associates. And this event is in honor of the 50th anniversary of Abt Associates, and in particular to honor Clark Abt, who is right down here, who is the visionary founder of this organization and the like. He's an engineer, he's an educator, an environmentalist, an entrepreneur, a social scientist, an all-around do-gooder who basically founded an organization with a very simple mission: to bring the best ideas, the best of science and social science, the best thinking there is to the world of practice and beyond, so that public policy, so that government products, so that every kind of activities, we can be more successful, more effective. And not surprisingly, this is evidence that he was wildly successful in doing that. Indeed, you know, his strong and simple vision has led to a company now that has 2,700 employees in 50 countries. Which brings me to say hello, those of you that are watching in other offices ranging from Bethesda and Atlanta and Durham, Cambridge, New York, Silver Spring, and beyond. But how very appropriate that on this occasion what we choose to do is what Clark Abt has always chosen to do, which is to look to the future, to ask what's the next big idea, to figure out where we should be going, how we can work and make the world a better place, and the new directions in evaluation, particularly comparing what's going on internationally and domestically, is quite exciting. But even more exciting than that, today we have the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick. You know, Tip O'Neill's famous for having said, all politics is local, and few things are more local than your governor. And what happens is, over the course of multiple campaigns, but particularly day in and day out and crisis in, crisis out, you really do come to know, you have a real sense of the person and the mind behind it and so forth. What is so remarkable about you, Governor, is your combination of extraordinary integrity on the one hand and intelligence and wisdom, but also your compassion, at the same time of a willingness to hold yourself to the highest standards and other people to the highest standards. And those don't always go hand in hand. So having a governor of both of ideas and great intelligence as well as real capacity to get things done, it's an enormous pleasure. And we will hope that you will continue on in many ways to make the world a better place. And of course, Abt itself has done a lot of work with the Commonwealth over the years and continues to do so. But Governor Patrick, as some of you will know, you came from the south side of Chicago, grew up in not the world's best neighborhood, those of you who know the south side, but because of a Better Chance, which is a Massachusetts program, he came on a full scholarship to Milton Academy. And we've kind of had him more or less ever since, few diversions. And he came here, he did well there, he got educated at a lesser known school down the other part of Cambridge that I hang out in. And he then got involved in all kinds of different factors. He became a lawyer and was quite involved. He became Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights during the Clinton administration. He spent some time in the private sector, including, by the way, a stint of 3 years on the Abt Associates board. And he's where he did extraordinary work, and then, of course, came back and has been the governor here. And what's striking is, I think all of the most interesting public problems cross boundaries. They cross boundaries between different geographic boundaries. They cross boundaries between business, government, and civil society. This governor has crossed boundaries constantly throughout his life. He's brought people together, but he's brought the lessons of each new experience into the next, and I think is why we're so lucky to have him here. He's really been the one that's taken the bull by the horns and helped the Mass Connector and Mass Health really work. Right now, we're struggling with the ACA, but it's clearly the right model. It's clearly the way to go and so forth. His work on innovation and bringing biotechnology and a whole variety of other things here has been great. I'm just about done. Yeah, no. Bio, IT, compassion, it's all the kind of qualities that I think we all hope for. And so, Governor, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to come and just say a few words of welcome here this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Governor.
Do you know what you could have gone on? I have plenty of time, but thank you very much for the generous introduction. And I just wanted to come by today to wish Abt Associates a happy 50th birthday. and to say, and just to remember what it was like, I want to say 15 years ago, maybe longer, when Clark Apt came to my law office in Boston. I had come back from Washington, where I'd spent, as the dean said, time in the first Clinton administration as head of the Civil Rights Division, and asked me if I would come join his board, your board. And I met Wendell soon thereafter. And I should say, by the way, that both Clark and Wendell then were the age I thought they are now, I should say, the age I thought they were then. And I came and became a part of this extraordinary organization which for 50 years has been thinking, as the dean said, about the future and how to make all of us better, how to make our societies better, how to make our democracies better, how to make our economies better, how to make them more efficient, more functional, more fair. And the notion of bringing brain power together to solve complex problems for governments, and you do, by the way, for the Commonwealth and for governments all over the country and around the world, for companies, for individuals who can engage apt associates to help think about how to solve problems. That's an incredible model and a visionary one. And as I say, Clark, here you are, finally, the age I thought you were. Wendy, by the way, has been ageless all that time. Like Clark, I also married up. It's wonderful to see you. And I just want to say how proud I am to have had even the brief association that I did with Apt Associates. And I think probably most of us feel that even a brief association is a lifelong one. And as your governor, I'm proud that you are a part of Massachusetts. Now let's hear from the panel. God bless you all.
Thank you, Governor, for that kind introduction and welcome. I also want to thank the MIT Media Lab for having us here and so forth. If you came up here by the elevator and have never been here before, you must return via the stairs. It is truly a remarkable building to see the interaction of space and ideas and the like. This is really quite a fascinating time for evaluation. I too served in the Clinton administration, and Governor, I think that was like 5 or 10 years ago, wasn't it? Something like that. But I worked on welfare reform. And it was a period when people really did use evaluations to help think about, should we do programs aimed at putting the welfare recipients to work immediately, or do training first, or what kind of training, things of that sort. And those evaluations were carefully done, randomized control examinations where you randomly assign people, one group gets the treatment, one group doesn't, and it'd go on for many years. It was very carefully done. Independent evaluators always came in, the state or whatever would decide what they wanted to do, and then independent evaluators would set it up, and it would be a long 4, 5, maybe 8-year experiment. And we'd see what the treatment effect was, and from that we could judge it. And because they were so carefully done and the like, people really believed it. The results themselves weren't highly political. Of course, people on different parties would cite one or another study more than another, but it was really very, very positive. That kind of evaluation has evolved to an even higher level, to extraordinary, more things going on the sort of domestic side. These large-scale, well thought out, independent evaluations, very carefully done, typically with randomized control. What's interesting is that a different kind of model has emerged increasingly now on international work, particularly around innovations. But a more common model, as you'll hear, is one where somebody in another country, a minister or an NGO or whatever else, says, I'd really like to focus on how to get more children vaccinated. And they might come to people at MIT or Harvard or whatever else, some other place, and say, we'd like your ideas about how to do that. And they say, okay, we'll give you our ideas, but in exchange we have to do a careful experiment so we find out. And the experiment comes in quickly, and you're working constantly back and forth between the researcher and the scholar, and I think because it's partly their innovation. And as a new idea comes out, you change it, and you move it, and so forth. To most domestic researchers, the idea of changing the experiment in the middle is like the most horrifying notion possible. And so what we want to do today is to talk about these different models and what's to learn and how to think about it and so forth. And so that's really the nature of this discussion, and we'll see where it all leads. And so I'm going to introduce the panel now, and not in the order I'm going to necessarily go to them, but let me start with Abhijit Banerjee. He is the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics here at MIT. He's also the co-founder of the Abdul Lafit Jameel Poverty Action Lab. Those of you that are involved in international development, particularly those who are interested in innovation and so forth, the Poverty Action Lab is an almost mythical place, spectacular. He focuses on development economics using field experiments as a way to discover causal relationships. Together with Esther Duflo, he's the co-author of Poor Economics. Having once wrote a book called Poor Support, I really like that title. The second person on my right here is Stephen Bell, who's an economist at APT. He is an expert in random evaluation methods, the domestic side of things. He uses econometric evaluation programs to think about disadvantaged workers and families, both in the US and overseas. He's edited 4 books, numerous papers, and the like. To my left is Michael Kremer. He's the Gates Professor of Developing Sciences in the Department of Economics at Harvard University, that smaller university down the way, or is it lesser, and a senior fellow at Brookings. His research has been on a wide range of issues like health, immigration, globalization, how to make vaccines cheaper. For example, he's got a recently published wonderful book with Rachel Glenister, Strong Medicine, Creating Incentives for Pharmaceutical Research on Neglected Diseases. Finally, at the end is Rebecca Maynard. She's the university trustee and professor of education and social policy at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a leading expert in the design and conduct of randomized controlled trials in the area of education and social policy. She recently published Openware Tools to Support Efficient Design and Rigorous Evaluations. Her most recent edited volume is Kids Having Kids. It's the second edition, which somehow is meaningful, in Kids Having Kids. She also was involved in the Clinton administration in various ways, and we overlapped some in Washington. So I want to start actually with Stephen. And Stephen, give me an example of kind of the sorts of work you're now doing or might work on, and how does an experiment look, how does it work, and so forth. What are the big lessons?
In the U.S. space?
In the U.S. space, yeah.
Right. Well, they are, as you've said, set up to randomize large samples of people or schools or businesses, whatever the unit of investigation. In one of the random selected groups, the intervention is applied. The other group is statistically equivalent but does not get the intervention. Pretty transparently, then, if you follow what becomes of the 2 samples over time and how that might diverge, you've found out what the intervention has contributed. This can be 1 to 5 years of follow-up. It can be at many scales, thousands, or even in one of the studies I'm a part of, 1 million recipients of disability benefits. Some of these have more than one treatment group, so you can learn about a multitude of policy differences in one study.
So tell me more about the disability example. How is that? Did you help figure out what they were going to do, or somebody else came up with the treatment? How did you get involved, and so forth?
This study for the Social Security Administration is a characteristic case of the federal government in this instance, but the funder could be a foundation or a government agency that has something that hasn't been done but is to be tested to see if it improves lives, and is to be tested with rigorous science. Apt Associates is not at the table in figuring out what policies need, where we need to learn more about policy. In this instance, in many instances, not in other settings we are, but most of our domestic social experiments, the nature of the innovation of policy is a given when we get brought in. And the government may spend a while getting that far. Hopefully they get the evaluator on board before anything goes into the field, because you have to build for success in implementing these things, have to design for success to build for success. We often, though not always, have a role in making the tested policy or program move forward in the field, but the parameters are handed to us of that dimension. The parameters of how the research is conducted and what the questions are that we can address effectively is more something we have the opportunity to mold.
And you might have a lot of different outcomes you'd evaluate, but there are outcomes in this case, Social Security Administration kind of focus. These are the key things we're interested in, and you may have suggested others and so forth. Is that
Right.
correct?
And most of these studies have a dozen or more indicators of success at multiple time points as the picture unfolds over the years.
Got it. And so overall, start from the first conception of their treatment idea to your final report might be 8 or 10 years.
Yes.
So by definition, spanning one president to the next, for example, or
And it might be for 4 years.
and multiple
but
secretaries
possibly
or
still
whatever, yes.
Spanning more than one presidency.
Okay, that's very helpful. Let me now turn to Abhijit to give an example of the kinds of work that you've done, different scales or whatever.
So I think there is obviously a range of work that people in JPAL do. I wanted to take us back to an example. First randomized control trial I was involved in with Michael. We showed up at an NGO in India, and I think their view was, they were very nice, very polite. They thought that we were completely loony, but they thought we were very good-hearted lunatics. So they were willing to indulge us. So basically they decided, fine, we're going to test out, we kept saying we need to test things. So they decided, fine, let's not go into anything that, even remotely controversial. Let's test something that's obvious. So these guys will just let them do something completely obvious, and then they'll go away satisfied. So fine, what are we going to do? We're going to double this teacher-student ratio and see if that improves test scores. It was obvious that it would improve test scores. Nonetheless, if these guys want to do a randomized control trial to find out the obvious, they could do it. So we did the randomized control trial. It had no effect on test scores, very precise 0. And at that point, I think what actually impressed them was both that fact that they were surprised and the fact that actually we seemed to, by that time, figured out, a bit more about their schools than they knew. For example, they didn't know that half their teachers don't show up. And we had some statistics on that. And so I think what that did was it created a confidence which was very, empowering for us. They sort of felt, okay, fine, these guys, this statistical methodology, I don't know whether we believe any of it, but they seem to be sensible guys. It looks like they know something. Fine. So then what that flowed into was, the next thing they said was nothing to do with any of that. They basically dropped that whole idea of expanding, hiring the second teacher. That was gone. And they switched gears completely. They said, we need help with immunization. That's the next evaluation we did was, children in this area are not immunized. Can you think of a way to do it? At that point, it was completely out of the blue, and we had no idea. I mean, frankly, I had never thought of immunization at that point, but that's what there was first on their mind. And so we moved from being basically people who were, being indulged to people who were now useful resource, not necessarily for doing evaluations yet. I mean, the evaluation piece took a while for it to be entirely embedded into their consciousness. But just as people who know stuff, people who work with us, who are careful with data, who sort of impose a discipline on the process of learning. And that general feeling that the process of learning needs to be structured and disciplined and organized, that I thought immediately got sold. And the next evaluation we did was on how to immunize children and so on. But that's how it's moved. It's moved all over the map, actually. We were trying to do one on how to reorganize land use. So it was not so much that we had a lot of domain expertise, but we were kind of people who were available to them to bounce ideas off and to interrogate as and when needed.
And so, unlike the story that Stephen told us, after the first indulgence, you were really there at the creation. And sort of, here's a specific task we want to happen. We want more people to get immunizations. Can you help us think about ideas? Did you sit around a table and sort of bounce ideas back? Did you do some, bring in somebody that actually knew what you might want to immunize against? What did you do? And
we knew what to immunize against. That much it's on the WHO website. We looked at it. that was not the hard part was, it was basically, there was a kind of a semicircular table, and I've sat around that table probably, 25 times in my life, and the discussion is always like, it's a very democratic organization, so everybody expresses their opinion on what the problem is, and at the beginning you get a complete, morass of, every possible ideas out there, and then somehow through the day you have to sift through those very patiently, and very importantly, I think engaging everyone in that conversation. But at the end of it, they were willing to let us try something. They had a very clear view of what the answer was. Again, the answer was that the government system doesn't work, so we have to find someone who will be present whenever on demand to immunize. That was their solution. But we managed to squeeze in a little extra on that. We persuaded them that maybe, I'm sure you're right, but let's try one little other thing, which is when these women show up, let's give them 1 kilo of lentils or some dried beans to make the occasion memorable. And this was a huge negotiation because, they didn't like the idea of paying people to do good things, but still, it wasn't so much. So it was just a kilo of beans, and beans are good for children, and somehow we managed to negotiate that. So that was settled. It turned out that, of course, in the end, they were again surprised. So, it's true that reliable delivery had a very substantial effect. It kind of trebled the immunization rate, but it doubled it again if you give them. So it goes from 3 to 6 times when you give them these dried beans. So it was, and I think at that point they started to take us a bit more seriously.
That's great. Michael, I wanted to turn to you also. What you've been, of course, collaborators in a lot of things. You've done everything from deworming to, but how do you think about these kinds of experiments and the engagement with the people directly? And how do you also how do you move it forward? How do you innovate? But also how do you maintain your independence?
Right. So, like Abhijit, many of the projects I've been involved in have come out of collaborations with an NGO or with the government. Let me give you an example, and I think that might illustrate some of the dynamics. So I was working with an NGO in Kenya. The NGO was concerned about water issues, and they had an approach based on an engineering solution. They went to the water source. They did some construction there that was supposed to make the source cleaner. And they asked us to evaluate it. And the approach we used there was they had a set, they were going to address hundreds of water sources over time. And they phased it in over time in a way that was random. So halfway through, some of the water sources had been treated and some hadn't. And we could look at the outcomes. And we found that there was a very big reduction in E. coli levels at the source itself. And there was actually some reduction in E. coli levels at people's homes and a reduction in diarrhea. So far, so good. But we found that the reduction in people's stored water at home, so people they go to the water source, they collect the water in 20-liter cans, or in plastic cans, they bring that to their home, pour it into a container. And when we tested the water in the containers, we saw the reduction in E. coli levels was only 1/3 as big as it was at the source. What was happening was the water was getting recontaminated. So based on that, we brainstormed a bit. And there's another approach that's being used in Kenya and quite being marketed all over the country, which is selling households small bottles of water treatment solution, which you add to your water before you use it. And that costs 30 cents for a month's supply. So not many people use it. And so that obviously has the potential to address there's chlorine in there that keeps the water safe for a few days. So we tried various approaches to increasing uptake of that. And we found that price made a big difference, unsurprisingly. We tried different types of marketing. Talking to them and thinking about it more, we realized since price makes a big difference, chlorine's super cheap. Actually, the packaging in those small packages costs more than the chlorine does. Maybe what you ought to do is just right at the source have a big container of this stuff that people are familiar with in Kenya, the Kenyan government's been promoting, and just make that available to people with a tap you can turn for the right amount. So that's an example where you mentioned at the beginning, you start with one idea, you switch to another. Well, we did the full evaluation of the original NGO program, but based on what we learned, we thought it's time to try something new. And I think, by the way, that this is actually standard in, this is saying what can US and international evaluators learn from each other. I think a lot of what's going on in the international context, it's really innovation as well. And so once you get into the innovation area, this really isn't, you don't necessarily have that same independence. You have to, you're going to try out the new dispenser. Well, if it turns out that the valve on that is being eaten away by the chlorine, as it first was, well, that's clearly not, there's no point doing the randomized evaluation. You're really in the pilot stage. So first you want to pilot. Then once you've got something that's working at the pilot stage, that's the time to do the randomized evaluation. So we went through that process, and we found that this, in fact, took take-up levels from single digits up to about half of people would use this. So it's a huge increase in the number of people who would treat their water. And then at some stage, there's a moving from just doing randomized trials to say, can this be scaled up? And so in this case, an NGO has taken up the challenge of scaling this up, an NGO called Evidence Action. And they're now reached, by the end of this year, they should, 4 million people in Kenya and Uganda should have access to this approach to getting the water treatment solution that was not reaching that many people beforehand. So I think that process is one where the idea that you're going to, one thing I think that companies have learned is you need a cycle, you need to keep innovation going. You don't, it's not like you innovate, you develop your product and then bye. We stick with that forever. You need continual improvement. And obviously you want to keep scientific standards involved, and it does definitely make sense to do evaluations multiple places, see if things generalize, maybe have other people involved in doing that. But I think this ongoing process of learning can be a really valuable one. And while there's a role for both types of evaluation, both internationally and in the US, I think one of the reasons why this is taken off so much in the international context is there are a lot of cases where there's collaborations between academics and NGOs which are able to be maybe faster moving, more nimble than governments, and really cycle through a lot of ideas till they find something that's promising.
Let me push you on this a little bit, and because there've always been a lot of evaluations out there of government programs. Mm-hmm. And again, going back to my own area, welfare reform and so forth, lots of people did evaluations of programs. They'd go in, they'd interview the people, people would say it really made a big difference for them and so forth. And in fact, when we started to do really serious systematic evaluations, we discovered most of what we thought we knew was almost exactly wrong. Mm-hmm. The people that were happiest were precisely the kinds of people that would probably find a job on their own, that kind of stuff. How, obviously, with people like you and Abhijit and others, you're going to work very hard to be as objective as you can and so forth. But is there a risk that this becomes a kind of the same kind of loose evaluation? Oh gosh, I see that's not working, we'll do X, we'll change the lever this, where, in the end, maybe you didn't learn as much as you thought.
Well, I think, as been the case throughout all of these presentations, a key thing is to have a treatment group and a comparison group, and whether that comparison group's never going to get treated in some designs, but in others will eventually get treated. But you have the random assignment to the treatment group and the comparison group, and then have outcomes. And ideally, it can be very interesting to look at subjective outcomes, but obviously it's good to look at objective outcomes as well. In this case, since there are already many medical studies on the impact of water treatment, that wasn't really what, as economists, we were trying to get after. We were just trying to get at what's the rate on use of the chlorine. In the case of chlorine, it's very easy. You test the stored water for, is there chlorine in there? So it's an objective outcome. And there we saw differences, sort of 50% in the group that had access to this, free distribution at the place where they collect their water versus typically single digits or low double digits for the groups that had other the standard social marketing approach where they have to go out to the store and buy it. I think clearly you need to put a lot of effort into making sure that you're being as rigorous as possible. The randomization goes a long way towards that, but other things are important as well.
Part of what I'm hearing you say is this really is as much about innovation and new ideas and learning as you go along, but finding a way to rigorously learn as you're moving.
Exactly.
Yeah. Becca, let me turn to you. I know you've obviously been quite involved in a lot of these kind of classic domestic sorts of evaluations, but you've also seen some of the others. Tell me what your view is about where U.S. evaluation is. Do you think there are lessons here, or what? Where do we go from here?
Well, I'm going to tell you my dream. My dream is that I think we are at a jumping off point for just a whole new era. I mean, we are at the point now where I think we know that most of the things that we try do not result in home runs. We have time and time again found that when we put studies to rigorous tests, we get much smaller estimates of program effectiveness than when we do observational study, a comparison group. And that's not surprising. There are a lot. We're dealing with complex issues. Since Clark stepped forward and created this wonderful organization, Apt Associates, a lot of things have changed. One of the things that's changed is we now have data systems that we didn't have before that mean that we do not have to. In the earliest study I worked on, we interviewed families in person, thousands of families every quarter. That's 4 times a year. That's very expensive. We don't need to do that anymore to get the kinds of data that we need to judge program effectiveness. We also don't need to spend a year designing a study and convincing people to do randomization. Sometimes we do. Sometimes they just won't buy it. But imagine a world where we have lots of problems with our education system. And what do? We have bright people, well-meaning people in the schools who are doing the best they can, which is to come up with a new idea and put it in place. And most of those new ideas don't solve the problem, and most of the time we don't test what we're doing, so we don't know. So I think we're at a point where we could routinize the institution of experimentation in the everyday work of schools and social welfare agencies and employment agencies. So, for example, here's one of my favorites. The state of Maine has a bright idea. They are going to give every 7th grader a laptop computer and access to the internet. And they're going to do it all in the same year, which I think was probably about 2006. So every 7th grader that year gets a computer. What do you think happened? There were all kinds of logistical breakdowns. There were disciplinary breakdowns. There were lost computers. There were teachers who weren't trained to use computers, et cetera. What if, imagine, what if we had randomly assigned some classrooms or some schools to get computers for their 7th graders in that year? We had a smaller number to monitor, to provide technical assistance to. We could document what we're learning. We could use those teachers. We could bring those teachers into our learning cycle. We could bring the parents into our learning cycle. Like, what do you do when the child is on the internet where the child is not supposed to be? That's not the school site. So we could institutionalize that. And how long do you think it would take us to have some really reliable evidence as to what that means for learning outcomes? Probably a semester, a year at the most, right? Because the data are right there. We have the data in the system. So I think we have, if we could all make evaluation win-win situations, and that's what you folks have done in the international setting. You go out and it is a partnership. So in a partnership evaluation, everybody wins. If we took this experiment with the computers and said, it's not about did you do a good job or a bad job, it's about help us understand what it takes to make this technology useful in the classroom? What do teachers need? What do parents need? What kinds of policies work and don't work for governing the setup of the computers to keep the kids on the right sites and off the wrong sites? So we can make that happen. Similarly, we can do this with teacher incentive plans. We did that in New York City, actually, because we didn't have enough money. So the solution was to randomize teachers out of convenience. But it didn't take long. It took a year and a few months to figure out whether or not the teachers were staying or going, to observe whether or not the student outcomes were better or worse. So with the data systems that we have, with the knowledge that we have about how to talk program directors and practitioners through the concerns, the real concerns they have about ethics. Is it unethical to deny some children those computers when others get it? Is it unethical to deny some teachers? Well, remember, most of the time we don't know whether this is really going to make things better or not. And if it does make it better, we will have the evidence to build the political support and to move the process towards institutionalization. So that's my dream, and I think we are more at that stage.
So I hear you saying, actually, similar to what Michael said, that your dream is that we can use evaluation as part of a learning organization to sort of be learning as you go along, to be feeding back a variety of indicators about what's happening and what's not. And the researchers actually going out and saying, gee, that's funny. Why did you think of actually giving people computers that, had this or that in it, or didn't have this or that in it, or whatever. So and because you have the outcome data so quickly, you can do it almost in real time, as opposed to.
Right, we can blend the improvement sciences and the data analytics movements. These do not need, right now, these are separate stovepipes. We have people who are saying the Carnegie Foundation is doing a great job with improvement science and the rapid cycle. What they're not doing, at least in my observation, is they're not taking that to the next step and saying, okay, now I've got what I think is a fully formed idea. Now I'm ready to put this to the test and put it to a test in situ where we can actually use a fully integrated operational data system to almost pump out those impact estimates, much as Walmart figures out what items to put on the front row of its display cases.
And go ahead,
Yeah, I'd
Steve.
like to throw in that Walmart's challenge, the safe drinking water in Kenya, even the student test score accomplishments. It's not, in those examples, it's not only that the decision making's nimble, action with a new idea can lag only months, not years, from when the idea gets noted, and that the data are quickly accessible. It's that the phenomenon to be achieved by your intervention is a rapid thing. Mm-hmm. And many of the ideas that we've tested with the what become quite long-range, often experiments in U.S. federal social policy, like the disability study I talked about. What we're trying to accomplish is people who haven't worked and have debilitating conditions that may mean they can never work and have incentives not to from their benefit income supports, change the incentives, get them to think about it, get them to move forward, get them trained, get them more intensive medical to improve their ability to contribute on the work site, try a job, succeed, earn their way off benefits. That is not going to be something we can learn about in a year or two. It is, though, if we were overlapping these things. If we tried the next idea, get it rolling. Don't wait for the findings in 2018. When you start a study like this in 2010, other ways to improve employment prospects for this population have been posited. Start the next study, have overlapping samples and follow-up, and always bring real-time information to policymakers on a continuous basis. We have to find a way to do it much more cheaply on the data side, but we can't make the world faster in the very things we're trying to observe and see become improvements over long run processes.
Michael, and the numbers in a minute, but Governor, by the way, I know you're a very busy man. So if you do need to leave at some point, we are grateful for having had every minute. No, but she may well, she warned me that it could happen, so I just want to make sure that whenever is appropriate, we're thrilled that you can be here for the time that you've given us. So thank you so much.
This may be slightly outside the scope, but in a way, by the time clients come to Apt Associates or any of you, they have already crossed the I'm an innovator Rubicon, and they are trying out their ideas. They are looking for ways to see whether their ideas are effective. I wonder if you've had any experience, particularly with governments, that haven't arrived at the disposition around innovation, that haven't yet figured out that innovation is in fact how you improve, how you strengthen, how you become more efficient, how you do better. If you've had, just in terms of trying to get state governments to, or other governments, to think about the value of innovation and testing out whether what they've always done is what they should continue to do.
How about you? Go ahead. How about you?
So, Governor, I mean, that's an excellent question. I guess there are two separate things that I think are there. One is, for example, in India, we work with the government of the state of Haryana, which is about the size of Massachusetts. And one of the things that's a challenge, so they were actually, I think we were mostly brought in on false pretenses. So in other words, their view was that we were helping them implement a new law which required them to do continuous evaluation. Our view was that that was the thin end of the wedge. And we're going to go in there and we'll try to persuade them that, that's just one of the things that in the system they need to change. And it worked out very well. That I think eventually they understood what we were trying to do, and they started valuing it. But for a while, I don't think they at all understood. They thought of us as being people who had some domain expertise. We knew something about education. We could help them maybe figure out this new terrain in education. We went in there with the view that we had some domain expertise, but what we really had expertise is in asking questions. And once we get in there, and the thing that was very important in that process was that it took us a while to figure out that to make that transition, we needed to build change makers inside the system. And they could not be the very busy bureaucrats who ran the system. They had to be pretty low-level people who had to be brought in, who had to be sort of fed the Kool-Aid of evaluation a little bit. And that's, I think, what we did successfully. So these were block coordinators who are kind of people with, not any great education. They might have a college degree, but they were not particularly sophisticated. But they started to see, because we gave them lots of time and sort of FaceTime and discuss the issues with them, they started to see the value of learning more rigorously. And so I think one of the things that came out of that is a great deal. I think we understood how important it was to bring the whole team with. So it's not that evaluation, some mantra that the CEO picks up and then throws at people. It sort of becomes owned by the whole system. And that, I think, worked out very well. They got very much into the spirit of experimentation. They would suggest, okay, let's try this, why not this? And there were sometimes wacky ideas, but I think the process was very valuable, and I think that's changed the entire discourse in that particular education system.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd perhaps add to that is, in some cases, it's possible to find an individual unit, whether that's a school district or a particular city government or even a nonprofit organization that can do some experimentation that is nimble and able to do that, and then to take some of the results of that to the people who are in charge of a larger unit. So an example that I was involved in was on treating kids for worms as a way to, so this is hookworm, whipworm. These used to be big problems in the US South, by the way. And looking at the educational impact of that. So a nonprofit organization did this in Kenya. Really stunning results where this led to very big improvements in school attendance as a result. And we followed this over time and see long-run impacts on incomes, in fact, now that the kids are young adults. So we took the results to the Kenyan Ministry of Education, and the Kenyan Ministry of Education, it's a national government organization. It's not, I wouldn't characterize it as nimble, but they had a very strong civil servant leading that. He saw the data. He said, this is very cheap. This is something we should do. But it didn't immediately get implemented. And it didn't get implemented because he's got to worry about a lot of things. And he didn't have the staff in place. You need to put together budgets for this. You need to think about which districts have worms, which don't. There's a ton of work that has to be done. So this was a case where this eventually got scaled up, but it required a concerted long-term plan and getting them some resources so that the ministry could develop this plan to work within their systems to figure out the training cascade through the district, national district, all the way down to individual schools to do this national deworming program. And Kenya is now doing it. I think this, and in fact, a number of Indian states followed Kenya in doing this. So I think this process of trying to encourage local experimentation can be very helpful. And one of the things I'm doing some work with U.S. Agency for International Development and help them found something called Development Innovation Ventures, which is a fund that people can apply to from anywhere in the world to try out new ideas. So it doesn't have to be the national government of Ghana. It can be an individual NGO. But the idea is it has to be something that eventually could be scaled up, either through commercial, private sector means or social entrepreneurship, or by a government. So it has to be, the cost structure have to be that way. And they have to say, we're going to rigorously test this. And then that provides the results that can then be taken to the governments to work on scaling.
Could you do an innovation fund like that for states or for the United States or whatever else?
Well, we have a lot of that in the United States now. If you look at the 2015 budget, there are 4 or 5 line items in there that are this Social Innovation Fund, the I3 Fund for Education, the Workforce Investment Fund. So there is a process now for incenting organizations to both draw on evidence when they decide what to try, but also contribute to evidence when there is no evidence out there. So I think another major advance, seems small, but I think it's going to be big, is that the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education just issued common evidence guidance, which is pushing something that will sound obvious, but it is about moving from development projects to testing projects and publishing all results. One of the problems we have in this field is that we tend to publish and share the good news, and we tend to not share the bad news. And all science, all good science is important, has important lessons. So I think if we blend these innovation funds and what they're trying to do with the commitment to sharing the information, that will make a big difference.
There's a lot of market for the bad news. It's all the non-news from these studies. We're right where we were in our control condition when we tried this new thing. But the example I was talking from, Governor, of the disability reforms, that predates these federal innovation initiatives that Rebecca mentioned. But the federal government did do pilot tests of the approach in 3 state environments, not with randomization to measure effectiveness, but to find out what the implementation challenges are. That's far cry from, though, letting local organizations, be they government or NGO, be the catalyst. This was the federal government going to some states and saying, can you try this out for us? And that's not much faster or more nimble than just doing it all from Washington.
So I'm going to open up for questions. There's 2 microphones here, so if you just please line up rather than raise your hand, and be brave. Please, a couple things. If you would introduce yourself and keep it reasonably short, and preferably end with a question mark. So please go ahead.
My name is Myron Alukian from Boston. One of the great public health achievements of the last century was community water fluoridation. About 74% of the U.S. population and public water supplies is now consuming fluoridated water. In Massachusetts, it's only 63%. Now, in spite of all the science and the data and studies that shows its work, it's cost-effective, et cetera, there is so much misinformation on the internet and the social media, 6 to 60 times more junk science than real science. And the question is, even though we prove that things work, there is so much misinformation on the internet. How do you see dealing with that so that we can make public policy decisions with the support of the public and the politicians and the leaders?
It's a
of our
great
state and
question,
country?
because ironically, at the same time we talk about evidence-based policy and so forth, you know, everybody seems to have their own study now, and it doesn't matter, you know, if you're clever, you might notice who funded it, but if they're clever, they'll have something that sounds to the opposite of what they are. And how do you combat this glut of bad information and help us distinguish?
So I mean, again, I think that is an area where we are making considerable progress. In the area of education, we do have something called the What Works Clearinghouse now, which was started about 10 years ago when the Institute of Education Sciences was founded. It was modeled somewhat after the Consor and Cochrane collaboration in medicine. So there is a process now for taking research on particular topics, for reviewing that evidence, making a judgment about, is this something you should pay attention to or not, and making that evidence publicly available in an orderly way. There are smaller versions of this in other agencies. There's crimes.solution, there's crimes.gov, there's something on teen pregnancy and parenting. So there are a number of other systematic review systems and repositories. And there is currently an interagency task force that is talking about coming up with a common evidence platform within government that would allow all of the agencies to filter the evidence on topics that are out there and make this information publicly available.
I mean, this is part of what we do in the Poverty Action Lab. It's exactly take the evidence that, mostly international, though we just started Poverty Action Lab North America, and put it on the web. And we synthesize the evidence, have a whole process by which, you know, the evidence from the randomized control trials is screened and summarized and then put on the web. So part of the value of our website is precisely to try to provide a kind of a clearinghouse of reliable evidence. And I mean, to the extent, I think this idea is out there and it's clearly needed. The other side of it, I think, is also needed, which we do much less of, and I don't know who does it actually. What we should do more is, I think, educate the media. I think the media has an enormous appetite for striking stories, not enough appetite for boring ones. And I think we need to educate them to be more tolerant to boring stories, that this worked, but it didn't change the world. I think.
Good luck.
There's no one from the media here, right?
No, but I do think this is. I'm not being cute at some level. It's the public that's got the appetite for compelling stories. But how do you? So we've had 2 examples. We have government. People often don't trust government, of course. You know, the Obama administration. So of course they're going to say they're doing great on the website, whatever, and universities. But is there a way to start? I mean, the hope here might well be by having, back up. When we were working on welfare reform, there were a lot of different ideas about whether you should, how to help welfare recipients. I already mentioned this. The most obvious thing in the world is you got to educate them where they can't possibly get better jobs. It just couldn't be more obvious. It just turns out that there's just a mountain of evidence that that wasn't the most effective way to start. And it was just horrifying to those of us who are educators, but the evidence was the evidence. So finding ways that people really can establish, this is really credible because it has been done with randomized, to the extent the media like to debunk stuff. They like, so the question of sort of having places like Poverty Action Lab or other things, finding some way to also go out and sort of say, and these are not good studies, or some way to really, because the truth is, people just, those who do behavioral psychology, they believe what they want to believe, and they believe a study that tells them what they already thought. So it's a critical problem.
So David, just to set the record a little bit straight, the What Works Clearinghouse has so far reviewed about 10,000 studies, a little bit shy of 10,000 studies. 1 in 9 studies that they review passes any minimal screen of credible evidence on effectiveness. So that means that there's a problem in the production process that most of the and they did not set their bar at the high. They have 2 levels.
No, that's great.
So I think the question, it was a really good one, and I do think that there is work on it, and JPAL is certainly, they've got their website. Washington State actually has its own system in the WISP.
Well, incredible organizations like APT, like the others that really say, okay, if they've said it, I believe it. Right over here.
My name is Melissa Anselmo. I work at one of the many hospitals in Boston. I do policy evaluation there. And one of the issues that we run into is, people become afraid of some evaluations because they're afraid of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That there's a good idea and we're going to evaluate it, and because maybe we're not looking at the right outcomes, that it's going to crush this really great idea. And I'm wondering if you guys have had any experience, and if governments or if organizations are more, are worried about that, and how you can work with ideas that maybe the study could slow them down.
My worry in that respect as a scientist is that too many studies, even the most rigorous with randomized designs, are not at a scale that is, we can be confident we'll find the good things that are accomplished. We have a very high bar for prove that you made a difference and make it 95% sure that the difference really took place. To get 95% sure, it either has to be a big difference or you have to have a very big database. And the breakdown, I think, is in the use of the findings when that highly conclusive evidence does not emerge. It is taken, as I sensed our questioner has experienced all too often, it is taken as a thumbs down when there just wasn't slam dunk good news of success. And that is even itself so context dependent on exactly how the concept for a policy that could work was actualized under the study's microscope. So a whole notion of strategies may drop out of the discourse based on an undersized piece of research of a particular variant that didn't have whopping success. And as a researcher, I don't like to see that happen. And it's a very big challenge against which we've made little progress, I fear, to get the world to recognize that a non-finding of success is often, we don't know which times, but often going to be just lack of enough information to have seen success that's there.
One other thing I would add to this is there are many times when organizations are concerned about if this doesn't look like it's working, it's not going to hurt us. But maybe this is advice to researchers as well, but that same organization, it probably faces some decisions about which way do we implement our program. Should we do it this way? Do we do it that way? Here's a problem we're facing. How can we try and address that? And they might be, while they may not be open on certain issues where they have a very strong belief something's working, there may be other issues that are open to them. And one of the advantages of this approach, I think, is very common in the international development context, is academics will go in and help them with obviously we would love to just get what's the impact of their program overall. But we're also often interested in these questions of, can you achieve, looking at two different variants of it, maybe even just at some process indicators on uptake of their program. So there are many cases where things start with that, and then they evolve eventually into here's a test of the overall impact of the program.
I think what I hear you saying, which is I think is interesting and relevant, and Becca, to some degree, you've said this as well, which is just because data is so more readily available, because you can get it, you can actually get information pretty quickly and start to adjust and try something different. That's pretty inconsistent with the old model. The old model from my old days, model where you set out the experiment and then you wait 5 years and then you find out whether it worked short-term, long-term, all that stuff. But I'm also hearing one other part of this, which is it also takes a case where both the people running the experiment, but also the people who are providing the evaluation are not only comfortable, they're actually anxious to actually go out there and get their hands dirty, see what's going on, and sort of, did you notice no teacher showed up? You probably weren't even measuring teacher absenteeism very directly, but kind of going 50%, it's hard to miss kind of thing. So that is breaking down one of the cardinal rules of independence. So how you think about that and so forth, I think but again, with lots of data, maybe it's different. Right over here.
Hi, I'm Anu Rangarajan from Mathematica. So you all talked a lot about going from pilot to scale, and some interventions, maybe if you have a lot of evidence that a lot of pilots have worked in a lot of settings, you can actually convince a government agency or some local government to go to scale. Now, some interventions may be dispensing a vaccine or something that's a little bit more straightforward, but a lot of the interventions are more complicated. And so when an NGO or an organization runs it, it's easier to maintain control and then make sure that the right dosage is got. Mm-hmm. But then you scale it up, it goes to a government agency, and you have the community health workers or just the local staff who may or may not understand implementation the same way as sort of an agency might run it. So how do you both try to make sure that there is some fidelity to implementation or even adaptation? I mean, what works in one context might not be fidelity that might be maintained. But how do you make sure that a strong dose is given when something is taken to scale? And then how do you measure impacts? Because the minute something goes to scale, it's much harder to measure impacts.
Abhijit?
So I guess maybe I don't necessarily think that maintaining fidelity, maintaining fidelity is an objective. We may want to maintain fidelity, but we may also say that the government has its own way of doing things and maybe it's not going to maintain the same level of fidelity. I think the role of the experiment, the NGO, is often to demonstrate that a concept works. And once the concept works, then I don't think my presumption is never that it's going to work in government, but that it should be tried in government. And at that point, you're working with the constraints of the government. And we've done this in education in India. We've gone back and forth between NGO-run programs run by an NGO with a government, programs run by a government. And all of those work differently, and the areas of slippage, exactly as you say, are different. But I think each of those experiments is informative. Even within the NGO, when an NGO is running it, you can vary the degree of control they are exercising and how much decentralization there is. So I think the point is never to. I think the idea that we will perfectly replicate this experiment everywhere is essentially it's impossible. I don't think one ever does that. It's always certain amount of guesswork is involved, and you're sort of trying to transpose one thing to another place, and what's the same program is a bit in the eye of the beholder. But I think there is I think if one is relatively disciplined about that, then there is a process of sort of trying to look for, this is likely to fail in government, let's try that piece with the NGO. And if it fails already there, then let's go back to the drawing board. So there's some dynamic process that builds in those concerns. I think the concerns about the fact that these things are not going to be immediately transportable need to be built into the experimentation.
But let me push you on that. I mean, because one could easily be said, look, we can try a lot of little things. They seem to work great, and as soon as we try and go to government, it's not going to work. That's not very comforting. I mean, you have been involved in.
That's not true.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's what you're saying, but they could be heard saying. I mean, I don't know whether your Indonesia example is a good one for that or not, but just, the question of starting with a small experiment with close engagement and so forth to national scale. I mean, that's how do you do that? How do you think of that?
So I think there are two separate. I mean, in Indonesia, one is a good example of one process. The one process that in Indonesia that we were always working with the national government, but I think the degree to which they trusted us was very different. So at the first experiment we did, this was about identifying how to deliver anti-poverty programs to poor people. That's the question. The government's very interested. They're not interested in whether this program works or not. They're interested in how do I make sure it gets to poor people.
So it's a targeting question.
It's a targeting question. So first experiment we did, the government basically was quite worried about all the ways in which this could go wrong. So we were allowed to give away $3. That's it, 10,000 rupiah. So an experiment where they wanted us to figure out, is the way that they target, which is through a statistical system, better or worse than asking the community to identify the poor? And they allowed us to do it, but it was very clear that this is going to be a special program of one-time giveaway of $3. And for that, now, once we did that, I think then the lessons from that came in, and the lessons were that the community was not particularly better than the government system, but much more popular. They were much more willing to say, okay, fine, you guys, you played by the rules that we impose on you, which is that you didn't annoy people, you didn't go around doing strange things in villages. And I think that allowed, the next experiment we did was with an enormous program. They were giving away $150 per year per family. And they were willing to let us randomize the delivery of that targeting in that program. And so it was more that you have to build confidence in the organization, and partly, it all sounds good. It's a randomized control trial. We randomize their standard errors. But there's a lot of words there, and I think part of what you're trying to do, at least maybe this is different in the U.S., but is to just within the organization build the confidence that you share the objectives of the organization to the extent that the organization wants to actually do things. And I think that took some time. And now I think we worked with one of their largest subsidy program, which is they asked us how to redesign RASKIN, which is the rice subsidy program, which basically covers half the population. And Indonesia has 220 million people, so that's a lot of people. I think that license came after a fair amount of, patient work with them, and I think so. That's one model. There's another model.
Michael, you've been trying to get in.
Yeah. I think you're completely right that programs are going to change, and as Anthony said, when you try to adapt them to another context, or even just scale them within the same country, but maybe to a government implementer or to a national government implementer. I think it's important to recognize that from the beginning and to plan for that from the beginning. And just to come back to this idea of innovation funds, one of the things that Development Innovation Ventures tries to do at USAID is to have several different stages of funding. So there's These numbers may sound very small to people in the US context, but there's $100,000 that people can apply for to pilot an idea without it necessarily a randomized trial. They can then apply for $1 million, up to $1 million to do collect rigorous evidence on impact, perhaps through a randomized trial, perhaps other ways. But then there's also funds up to $15 million that people can apply for to say, okay, we have something where we think there's evidence. Now we're going to systematically work to adapt that to another context, and we're going to try it at scale. We're going to collect more evidence on whether it's working at scale. Maybe depending on the situation, maybe that's monitoring data. Maybe that's another full-scale randomized trial. And that recognition that there's that cycle is, I think, a very important element of this. Because one disadvantage, I'll say, of the approach that's in, I don't say disadvantage, let me say limitation of the approach that's used in the international context, is that because often this is collaborations between researchers and, let's say, an NGO, there's not necessarily an automatic mechanism to translate that into public policy. And the incentives and, to some extent, the skills of academics may be to publish the next journal article rather than to work with do a very long, time-intensive work with the national government to figure out how could this be adapted, working on all the budgets and schedules and memos and so on. So having resources, having some sort of fund that's available really to cover all three steps of this, I think is something valuable. Let me just draw one contrast I think there are some great examples domestically in the US of innovation funds, like in the Department of Education. They're often focused on a particular sector. And so one advantage of having an approach that's really broad across sectors is that you can sometimes get, and we've gotten some really creative proposals that might not be what the health sector would come up with, but really come at a program from a different angle. And if they're successful, then they may be taken on. I don't see these as alternatives. It makes sense for the education departments doing really exciting work in the US. It's great that they have that. I could see something, not every part of the US government is at the same stage, and having some sort of national fund that could be applied potentially across sector areas could be very valuable.
We need to wrap up, but so this will be the last question.
Thanks. Judy Singer, Harvard University, and for the purpose of this event, apt alum from 77 to 82.
She's sort of my boss too, so.
My question is about the role of replication. And I was at a talk last week, actually, Becca and Steve were there as well, by Johnny Ioannidis from Stanford, and he's published an entire series of papers that have the roughly optimistic titles, Why Most Published Research is Wrong. And in study after study in the context of medicine, which is often held up above social experimentation to having both heavy use of RCTs, but also this much more of a philosophy of at least trying to replicate. And what he's been able to show in a variety of domains is that what starts out as a blockbuster finding, and I will note that most of the examples you gave were these orders of magnitudes of the kinds of effects that in reality we don't always see. He's been able to demonstrate depressingly that over time, as studies get replicated, and my question is more about the incentives and disincentives for replication, that the effect size on average goes vanishingly small, close to zero. So I would just wonder if you could comment in both the domestic and the international settings about the incentives and disincentives for both firms and for academics to think about replication and the consequences for what we can learn from social experiments.
Let me I'll just go down the panel, and also panelists, if there is a last comment or insight you'd like to draw out. And let me just go in the order I did in the first place. Stephen.
The replication test is the newsbreak finding is by chance the case of a big difference that isn't causal. But you do studies, if you aren't working in a world that Becca mentioned earlier of everything gets published, the thing that gets attention and gets practice changed in medicine, perhaps. I don't know. I hope these weren't cases of where we'd gone a long way down the road to get standard clinical practice to move somewhere else, only to find that that wasn't going to help. But if a study gets that ball rolling, despite the high bar, 1 time in 20, there's a false positive. And if there are enough medical studies, sometimes the first or the second try will be that 1 in 20, and then the rest of the data come in. And it all damps down to the true mean of effectiveness. That would be one thing that I could imagine leads us up the road to, down the primrose path to something that's where we've moved too soon. And you comb the data and the publication literature, and examples emerge of that based on just the structure of how we judge scientific evidence and our confidence in findings as study emerges and then more studies come along.
Abhijit?
So, this is a problem of all empirical research, and I would say less so of randomized controlled trials than any other form. Because at least randomized controlled trials are because they're a pain, because you have to organize them, they take time, you can register them. If I want to run regressions till I find a result, I can do it in my office, and nobody would know how many regressions I've run. So I feel like it's absolutely a problem. I think it's a problem that fields try to address through having registries, through having all studies registered if possible. We try in economics. We have now launched, the American Economic Association has launched its registry, and we're trying to have all studies that will get published registered, and it's a way to sort of keep track of how many times you've tried before you got that startling result. And I think, but it's a problem, I think, all the more so of every other form of empirical research. It's not an argument against randomized controlled trials. It's an argument against evidence, in a sense, and whether we can ever have reliable evidence. But it's sort of, I think randomized controlled trials gives us the best chance of regulating that process, because it's at least it's so much more substantive what you have to do to get a result.
Michael?
Yeah, so I agree with those comments. I think it makes sense to proceed on the front of trying to improve our systems and our incentives by creating institutions like registries, by having funders in a position to say, we'll fund we'll try to support the scale, but we want to support additional evidence collection at that stage. But at the same time, one shouldn't use this as an excuse for passivity and saying, oh, there's no point in using any evidence, we'll just go by the anecdotes. Because sure, the first careful study may, by chance, give you a particularly exciting result, which may come down over time. But certainly the first anecdote is going to be a lot more subject to that problem. I think there is a sense in which the things that get the attention are going to be the ones that have the most dramatic results. So it's a little bit worse than there's only 5% chance that this will happen, because the things that get the attention will be bigger than that. But in many cases, when you look at this empirically, and in the international context, we're fortunate that some things, politicians often want to get a study from their area. They don't just want a study from Peru. And that means some things have been evaluated at lots of places. So when Mexico introduced conditional cash transfers, they did a very careful evaluation. And for some reason, that set the precedent. So now they found great results. 30 different countries have adopted similar programs. And if you look at and often they have randomized evaluations of them. And when you look at those, I don't want to claim the results are identical everywhere, but it is remarkable how much the basic results seem to generalize.
So I would just add to this that there is very, very strong evidence in the academic literature of publication bias against null and negative findings. If you do sort of a little forest plot of results, you get this big bite out on the, you don't get a nice normal distribution of evidence. So that's an issue, and that is something that needs to change in the academy if we are going to address this problem. Part of the rap on the What Works Clearinghouse in its early years was it was called the Nothing Works Clearinghouse. Well, all of the positive results were in the big positive results, the blockbusters, were in the studies that were screened out because of quality issues. They were not judged to be credible evidence. And then another issue that we have is, what was the study intended to measure? What was the theory of change? What did we expect to happen? Did anybody expect, when Perry Preschool was designed in 1964, that this was a program that was intended to reduce the prison population? Yet right now, that is the blockbuster result. We are making federal policy on a study done in 1963 on the basis of a finding that nobody even imagined would be examined when the study was designed. What do you think would have happened if that result had not turned up positive? We would not even know that it was looked at, I am guessing. So I think that we as a scientific community need to be a bit more judicious about laying out what our outcome measures are, and to be clear when we are veering into the exploratory research. The Department of Education has in fact instituted a policy of requiring their contractors to declare what is a primary hypothesis, primary outcome they're going to examine, and what are exploratory. And we need to think about a better system for ensuring full reporting of studies that are quality studies, for sifting those studies, and for admitting when I don't think we should not look at data in an exploratory way, because we might learn something, but I think we then need to replicate to see if that finding is real.
So I thank you all. I think it is a really extraordinary time. New data, the speed, researchers who are much more engaged with the people who and their goals themselves, but also thinking hard about how do we make sure we get the right results and the like. I think Becca, your dreams may come true, although my mother also told me to be careful what you wish for. I want to thank all the people in Apt Associates, particularly Mary McGuire, but her whole team and everyone else, for all the extraordinary work they did, both here and in Bethesda and Atlanta and other places. I want to thank the MIT Media Lab folks. As I say, do walk down, see what's going on. You'll see what space can do it, and the great space and the AV teams. I also want to give a special thanks to Wendell Knox for your great work. I also want to thank most especially Clark Apt for starting with his vision and his culture and his goals, something that would lead to something this dramatic. And lastly, and most importantly, this extraordinary team of people up front here for taking your time and your energy to stimulate us and excite us about the future. Thank you all very much.